Several years ago at annual conference, I was looking at a sale of books, and a friend was also there looking at them and picked up a book and mentioned to me that its title was Creative Suffering. Well, my sense of humor kicked in, and I said, well, it has to be a book on parenting. The ancient Israelites had a great interest in fathers. Long lists of genealogies tell us of father after father, and sometimes of mothers. The knowledge of where they had come from helped anchor their security in an uncertain world. It also helped them to identify themselves and to see into the future. The great promise to Abraham was that he would be the father of a great nation. The promise was not made because he was a perfect individual, and it was not made because he would be a great father, because he wasn't. And he made huge mistakes both with Ishmael and with Isaac. Isaac, in turn, was the inheritor of that promise, and he was also a loss as a father. Jacob, the son of Isaac, inherited the promise, but he also inherited the family weakness at parenting, it would seem. But in all of this, they were still men of love. They loved their wives, and they loved their children, even if not always wisely. They were also men of faith. They largely believed God's promises, even when the promises seemed ridiculous and made no rational sense. They were men who largely remained true to God, even when to do so seemed foolish and still made no rational sense. Let's consider some forefathers of faith today. After all, it's Father's Day, that seems appropriate. There was the Apostle Paul. Now, Paul was a thick-headed, stubborn man whom God practically had to take by the collar and shake before he figured out what it was that God wanted him to do with his life. But after that, there was no holding him back. He suffered shipwreck, beatings, stonings, ridicule, long, arduous traveling in order to witness to the truth of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, some scholars have questioned whether Paul had a form of ADD. He seemed unable to stay in place for long at all. Paul's mind moved as restlessly as his body did. Now, I've always appreciated the fact he might have had to deal with something like ADD. We sometimes put people in the Bible into an unreal glow, but they were real people with problems and struggles. They had issues, personal, family, societal issues. Some were physically ill. Some may have had psychological illnesses or conditions. But that didn't make them into a subcategory of human. God called to them as well as to those who had other kinds of problems or what may have seemed like less or fewer problems. All were called to mission and ministry. So we know that Paul had some sort of physical illness, or at least it's assumed that it was a physical illness, but he may have also struggled with psychological issues. And the church owes much of its beginnings to Paul. Scholars have even speculated whether the church would exist today if Paul hadn't been such an active, dedicated missionary, supporting the church both by preaching and by extensive writing. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, because I do think God would have called someone else. But Paul was the one who was called, and Paul answered, along with other forefathers and foremothers of the faith. Now, today we can personally study the great people of the Bible, such as Paul, because of the courageous efforts of people who believed that the scriptures should be translated and printed in languages that the average people understood, instead of just in Latin or Greek. Now, the irony of that, of course, is that the Bible was originally translated into Latin, the Latin Vulgate, you may have heard of it, because Latin was the most common language that the most people would understand. But years had passed, Fewer people spoke Latin or could read it, and they'd kind of grown up this idea that the Bible was too esoteric or something for people to understand. And one of the things that got Martin Luther into trouble was his translation of the Bible into German. Tyndale declared he would make a translation that would enable a plowboy to understand. Tyndale was later imprisoned and executed for his views and for his work. And by the way, Tyndale's translation of the Pentateuch and the New Testament formed the basis of the King James Version, and it's still used as a reference for most translations today. Wycliffe, Coverdale, and John Rogers are also names heard for their work and for their sacrifice, their struggles in translating the Bible. Now, because I'm a Methodist, one of the forefathers that would have to be mentioned today would be John Wesley. I find John to be a fascinating man. Like so many other people of faith, he was not perfect. He began as an intellectual Christian. That is, it was not a faith of his heart. He did not feel faith. He simply, his brain assented to it, but he felt his heart was uninvolved with it. There was a difficult crossing to America. This was before, of course, long before actually it became the United States. And John was impressed by the heartfelt faith of the Moravians who were on board the ship during this dangerous period that they faced. So he spoke of his spiritual struggles to them. The Moravians advised him to preach faith until he had it, and then because he had faith, he would preach. Well, it didn't happen right away. After a disappointing time in America, John returned to England. And one night he was invited to attend a Bible study. He didn't really want to go, but for some reason he did go. It was on a street called Aldersgate. And that's where he had what he described as a heartwarming experience. It was a life-changing experience as well. It was not the last. A number of transitions would push him along the career that he would follow, and sometimes they weren't always transitions that he accepted easily. You may be aware that John also never intended to start a new church. His interest was the spiritual renewal of all people regardless of their church affiliation. It was only as an elderly man that he finally consented to ordain Methodist pastors and to send them to the church, then being officially formed on the shores of the new United States. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a great hero to me. He was a German pastor during the Nazi period. He struggled against Adolf Hitler, but I will always be a little uncomfortable with some of the decisions he made, some of which resulted in violence. If he had not been executed by Hitler, I think that Bonhoeffer would have struggled himself with the rest of his life over whether he had done the best or the right thing. I know that my own father never settled into a complacent point of view, but always did a certain level of wrestling over issues and faithful living, in the same way that Paul did, as Wesley did, as Bonhoeffer, I'm sure, would have, as most of the faithful have done when they have been honest with what was happening in their inner life. Sometimes, like Jacob, we wrestle with God, and we wrestle with the reality of what it means to be a person of faith. Jacob, that's what our scripture reading, of course, is. Jacob wrestled all night, perhaps knowing, perhaps not knowing, that who he wrestled with was God. Now, God could have destroyed him with no more than a mere touch, but instead allowed Jacob perhaps even encouraged Jacob excuse me, to wrestle, even allowed Jacob to come close to winning. Neither won and neither lost. At the same time, it wasn't exactly a draw. Jacob has struggled with God and with other human beings. God even says that Jacob has prevailed. But Jacob goes forth from the wrestling ring changed by the encounter. He limps from an injury to his leg. But as one commentator writes, it was a symbol of the fact that injury was a symbol of the fact that Jacob was in the grip of a power which his self-assurance could not match. Jacob knew that henceforth he would never walk in lofty arrogance again. Jacob also goes forth with a new identity. He would no longer be Jacob, but Israel. Now, in the long run, I suppose that Jacob wrestled with himself as much as he wrestled with God. The old self lost, but the new self won, not against God, but with God. Hopefully, we in turn will be able to pass on to the generations yet to come a rich heritage of wrestling heroes. I hope that distant generation will be able to look at our faults and our struggles and find at the end God's presence and that God blesses them through our story. Happy Father's Day.